Okay, ATP breakdown from glucose and fat metabolic pathways. There's my crude drawing of the overview of these processes. Hopefully, within the slides, I can demonstrate a little bit more detail. But basically, that's what we're looking at here. To get started, we kind of need to understand ATP, what it is. It is the energy for all biological work, from muscle contraction, cell respiration, transportation, you name it. It is the driving force for cellular activity. It is technically termed andosine triphosphate. It's 100% renewable energy, which means when it's broken apart, it loses a phosphate, gives the energy, and then it can regain that phosphate ion again and reform itself, ATP. Um, when it breaks apart, it turns into ADP. Um, but basically, it's a unique molecule and one that's very important for survival. Um, basically, my diagram, I just want to kind of go over the basic overview of what's happening in this production process. So basically, we have food, carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, um, which then transforms into glucose or fatty acids. Glucose is basically the main substrate, so to speak, and that turns into where are we at? Yeah, that turns into pyruvate through a process called glycolysis. Once that pyruvate is it's changed into pyruvate, which then can be sent into the mitochondrial, the matrix of the mitochondrial, where then it changes to acetyl CoA. Okay, and then that acetyl CoA then enters into a cycle called the citric acid cycle, which then transfers down to the electron transport chain where oxidative phosphorylation occurs, which then changes into CO2 and H2O as the byproducts of this process. So that's basically the overview. So the beginning point is glycolysis, and we have this diagram right here. Basically, you have the glucose molecule, okay, and then it goes through the process of glycolysis, and this is this 10-step process. A bunch of enzymes and coenzymes, a lot of redox, oxidation, reduction, oxidation processes. We're producing a little bit of ATP. We're creating hydrogen ions. We're creating a lot of NADH, a lot of FADH in order for these products to then enter the electron transport plane. But the main product that comes out of here is pyruvate. That's what's going to power the ADP production in the electron transport chain. So if we go down, this is the electron transport chain. Basically, we've got a cutout of the inner mitochondrial membrane. So we have the inside of the cell of the mitochondria, and then we've got this outer cell that separates between the intermembrane space and the cytoplasm of the cell. So in between that space, we've got this proton gradient. Okay, so we've got electrons. We got a high amount of electrons here and a low amount of electrons here. So a lot of times it's just passing back and forth through the membrane. Now, these four little protein complexes here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we've got this blue one. This blue one is the the ATP synthase. That's where basically it is the assembly line for ATP, but it's the final destination where the most ATP is going to be created. But in the first one, it goes in and out of this proton gradient. But the second one is the citric acid cycle, and that's where we're creating the FADH and the NADH, and that's going to go then to another enzyme and then to another coenzyme. It gets passed down this chain, okay, slowly building itself up to get to the ATP synthase. And at that point, that's where we start to make the ATP for the cell. So if we go down one more slide, this is the actual ATP synthase. As you can see, it connects the outer membrane into the matrix. This is where the hydrogen ions come in, the NADH and all that, and this is where oxidative phosphorylation occurs, and this is where we get our production of ATP. The next slide will explain the citric acid cycle. Again, another bunch of complicated chemical reactions, but basically we've got the pyruvate on the outside, changes to acetyl-CoA, then that acetyl-CoA then jumps into the citric acid cycle, mixes with oxyacetate and citrate, and then that process creates, again, more products to pass through the electron transport chain to create, at the end, ATP for the cells. So out of this process, we get about 36 ATPs, which isn't a whole heck of a lot. Again, ATP reserves enough for several seconds of explosive all-out physical activity. So basically, that's what we've got here. So we don't have a whole heck of a lot, but we do have a place where we can go get a heck of a lot, and that would be into the adipose tissue. Now, energy from fat, basically, and we can get 60,000 to 100,000 kcals from these endophyte cells, which are basically triglycerol, and that molecule is basically one glycerol attached to 3 fatty acids. Okay, so now this process is called beta oxidation. Now this process basically starts when there's glucose levels are really low in the blood. So then that triggers the pancreas to send out hormones. Epinephrine is one of them. There's several other ones. But then that sends it to the adipose tissue, which then triggers the breakdown of these triglycerols. So basically, that stuff then jumps into the bloodstream, and then that stuff is delivered to the cells that are going to need, ATP, the products for ATP production. So then, okay. So we start with that state. We get there. So then it attaches to the blood cells, and then it gets transferred into these processes. And now you got the 3 fatty acids and you got the glycerol. Okay. Now the glycerol, okay, that's going to just jump out of this beta oxidation process and go into a process called gluconeogenesis. Now, that gluconeogenesis basically is just glycerol turning into glucose. It's going to use a bunch of, not too many, but just a couple enzymes are going to just change it into glucose, and then that glucose is going to go through the processes that we've already explained, through the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle and oxidative phosphorylation, and you're going to create ATP that way. Now, the fatty acids, okay, for this particular one, it's going to be palmitic, a 16 carbon palmitic acid. Okay. Now, that process, this is the beta oxidation. So what's going to happen here is that palmitic acid goes into the activation outside the cell, right? And then it's going to use a bunch of other enzymes. It's going to break it down in order to make it, because it won't go inside the cell. So it needs another chemical makeup to change it. So once it gets into the cell, then it doesn't want to then other chemicals attach itself to these carbons so it won't leave the cell. Okay, once that process happens, then the beta oxidation can get started. And this is the slide that demonstrates the chemical breakdown. It's very complicated with a lot of enzymes and a lot of processes going on. But basically, out of this, we are going to get acetyl-CoA, okay, which of course was part of the power plant to run the ATP production prior. So, right? So we've got it to acetyl-CoA, and then it goes into the Krebs cycle, and then it goes into the ETC. But so beta oxidation. Out of that beta oxidation, out of that 16 carbon free fat, the fatty acid, you're going to get 8 acetyl-CoA instead of just 1 from the prior one. So you've got, and then through this process, through this beta oxidation process, you're going to get 7 times around this. Okay, and every time you do that, you're going to be creating a certain amount of ATP. So out of this, you're going to get 8 acetyl-CoAs, 24 NADHs, 8 FADH2s, and 8 ATP. Okay, and all of those are going to then go into the Krebs cycle. Now, so times that by 3, right? So we got 31 NADH times 3. Okay, which gives us 93. And then you get 15 FADH2s times 2, which gives us 30. And then you get a grand total of 130 ATPs. The diagram that I put here, it shows a different diagram, but that's kind of how I kind of want to finish with this, because depending on, physical training means a lot. If you can train your body to more efficiently oxidize fatty acids, then you're going to create more ATP. So it's not really a set number. It's kind of a set number, but it's not a set number. And these processes can be enhanced and hindered. So depending upon your physical training, you can really maximize ATP production, or just your fitness levels. So there's a lot that goes into these processes. I think it's crucial to understand that carbohydrates and glucose are basically the primer that constantly kind of greases this machine that allows, for ATP production to come from adipose tissue, from proteins. But glucose is your main driving force, and that comes from a lot of carbohydrates. So in like a training aspect, I guess we would have to understand this. You don't want to ever have any lulls in the chain here. So you constantly want to keep on top of your carbohydrate and your glucose levels in order to keep the ATP production going as smoothly as possible. So I think that's it. I covered enough of it. Thanks. Bye.